The world is in debt. Every single country. It's getting worse by the day. The United States owes over $38 trillion, the highest amount in its history. The European Union is carrying around $14 trillion. Japan, once the epitome of economic strength, now has a debt that tops $9 trillion. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia and powerhouses like Germany and China have racked up enormous sums. But here's the real kicker: if every country owes money, who is actually being paid back? Who are the creditors? This is the question we need to ask, because in the end, this system of debt is what holds the entire world together. It's the invisible foundation that props up economies, powers global trade, and fuels entire nations. But there's a dark side to it, a side most people don't see. What happens when the debt becomes too big? What happens when it all unravels? This is what happens when all countries go bankrupt. It seems unimaginable, doesn't it? How could the world's largest economies, countries we rely on for everything from jobs to technology, be on the brink of collapse? It feels like an absurd idea, like something from a dystopian novel. But it's a very real possibility, and we are slowly but surely heading toward that point. The truth is, the more countries borrow, the more they dig themselves into a hole that at some point they may never climb out of. But let's take a step back and understand how we got here. You see, national debt isn't a new concept. It's been around for centuries, but it was born from a different kind of necessity. Picture this. It's 1694. England is in the middle of a war with France, and the royal treasury is empty. The king has no money to fund the war, so what does he do? He does something that had never been done before. He turns to merchants, offering them a promise: if they lend him money, he will pay them back with interest from future taxes. In other words, the king is borrowing money that he doesn't even have, promising to pay it back over time. This was the birth of government debt, the birth of bonds. This arrangement wasn't just an economic lifeline for England. It changed the course of history. Countries everywhere soon realized that they could do the same. They could borrow to fund wars, to fund infrastructure, and to fund expansion. In return, investors received something valuable: guarantees, promises from the government, which could be traded and bought. This led to the rise of modern finance, a system that allowed nations to expand their power by borrowing vast amounts of money. But the problem? This system didn't come with a clear endpoint. Over time, it became a perpetual cycle of borrowing. Nations borrowed more to fund projects, to pay for social programs, to keep economies afloat. Debt wasn't just a tool for survival, it became a way of life. The system became the very backbone of the world's financial structure. Fast forward to today, and the numbers are staggering. Total global debt has hit over $315 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy. The US alone owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. And other countries, from Germany to China to Saudi Arabia, all of vast amounts as well. But the question remains: if everyone is in debt, who is on the other side of the equation? Who is being paid back? The answer isn't as straightforward as you might think. The debt that nations owe isn't just to foreign countries. It's mostly to themselves. A large portion of debt is owned by domestic institutions, American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and even the Federal Reserve itself. The rest of it is owed to foreign nations. Countries like Japan, China, and the UK hold the remaining debt. But when people say the US is in debt to China, it's only partially true. Japan holds around $1 trillion of US debt, and China holds about $800 billion. But in the grand scheme of things, most of the debt the US owes is to itself. And that's where the real story begins. Nations have created a web of debt that connects them to each other in complex, often invisible ways. For example, the US borrows money, and investors, domestic and foreign, buy bonds. The Federal Reserve, in turn, often buys these bonds back. Then, through taxes, the government pays interest on the bonds, which is funneled back into American savings accounts, retirement funds, and pensions. It's an endless loop. The debt is real, but so is the cycle of borrowing and paying. But what happens when that loop breaks? If all countries were to go bankrupt, the first and most obvious consequence would be a complete loss of confidence in the global financial system. Investors, banks, and markets that rely on government bonds as a safe investment would suddenly see those bonds as worthless. When governments can't pay their debts, it sends shockwaves through the financial markets. Interest rates would skyrocket, and no one would trust currencies or bonds. The value of money would collapse. Countries would print more money to try to pay off their debts, causing hyperinflation. The price of everyday goods would skyrocket, and the cost of living would become unbearable for most people. A loaf of bread, which used to cost a few dollars, could end up costing hundreds. Families would struggle to afford even basic necessities. Now, imagine the banking system, one of the backbones of the global economy. Banks rely heavily on government bonds as secure investments. If those bonds lose their value, banks would be unable to function properly. Central banks, which control national currencies, would have few, if any, tools left to stabilize the economy. Without the ability to print money that has value or borrow funds, entire financial institutions could collapse overnight. Businesses would also feel the impact. With credit markets in chaos, companies wouldn't be able to borrow the money they need to operate. They couldn't expand, couldn't pay their workers. Unemployment would skyrocket. Major corporations would file for bankruptcy. People would lose their jobs. The global supply chain would halt. Food, medicine, fuel, everything would become scarce. And it wouldn't stop there. Governments would be overwhelmed, unable to provide basic services. Healthcare, education, law enforcement, public safety, these services would all start to break down. Countries would no longer have the resources to maintain order. People would protest, riot, and demand answers. Governments would struggle to maintain control. The collapse would lead to global instability. Economic powerhouses would crumble, and countries with less wealth would suffer the most. Nations with fragile economies might collapse entirely. Refugees would flood into other countries, causing even more strain on resources. Border conflicts could erupt as countries scramble for dwindling resources. In some places, civil war could become a very real possibility. But here's the thing. When countries go bankrupt, the rich, the ones who actually own the debt, don't lose everything. They might lose some investments, but they'll survive. The creditors, the global financial elites, are the ones who benefit the most from the debt system. Meanwhile, the working class, the average person, pays the price. Taxes will rise, pensions will shrink, savings will evaporate. Debt will flow from one hand to the next, but the poor and middle class will bear the brunt of it. So, who really wins when the system collapses? The answer might shock you. It's the ones who have the power to control the flow of money. The wealthy, the investors, the banks, they'll rebuild the system for their own benefit. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is left to pick up the pieces. And here's the scariest part. We're already on the path to this future. The global debt crisis is unfolding right before our eyes. Countries continue to pile on debt, and the global financial system is showing more and more cracks. We don't know when it will happen, but we can already see the signs. The world is on the edge, teetering between financial disaster and recovery. If this all sounds terrifying, it's because it is. But it's also a reality we can't ignore. The global financial system built on debt is a house of cards. And at some point, it could all come crashing down. What happens when all countries go bankrupt? It's not just an economic collapse, it's the end of the world as we know it. If this gave you a new perspective, if you feel like you're finally seeing the hidden truth about debt and its consequences, then hit subscribe. Let's dive deeper into these complex, uncomfortable realities together.